11,000 years ago, before any city existed on this earth, before anyone had laid one brick upon another or dragged a plow through soil, before the wheel turned or the first letter was pressed into clay, a group of people climbed a limestone ridge in what is now southeastern Turkey and built something that should not have existed. They left behind pillars as tall as 3 men standing on each other's shoulders. They carved wild animals into stone with extraordinary precision. They arranged these massive columns in perfect circles. And then, when they were done, when centuries had passed and the place had served its purpose, they buried it all beneath the earth, deliberately, carefully, and with what can only be described as reverence. Then they walked away. And for 10,000 years the world forgot. What they built is called Göbekli Tepe. And if you have never heard of it, that is about to change, because this site, this dusty, windswept hill on the edge of the Hiran Plain in Turkey, may be the most important archaeological discovery in the history of human civilization. Not because it is the most spectacular, not because it is the largest, but because it completely and irreversibly overturned everything we thought we knew about how human beings became human. It demolished a story we had told ourselves for over a century, the story of how civilization was born, and replaced it with something far stranger, far older, and far more interesting. Before we go any further, if this is the kind of story you want more of, if you want to drift into sleep each night wrapped in the deep, quiet past of humanity, then please take a moment right now and hit the like button on this video. Subscribe to this channel so you never miss another episode. Leave a comment below telling us which ancient mystery you would like us to explore next. Your support makes it possible for us to keep bringing these stories to you, and knowing that you are out there listening makes every one of them worth telling. Now, let us begin. It is a cool October evening in 1994. The sun is low, painting the limestone plateau gold and amber. A German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt is walking through difficult terrain, uneven ground, large basalt rocks, the kind of landscape that discourages you. He has been looking for something. He is not sure he will find it. He has been asking in villages whether there is a hill nearby scattered with flint, because flint is the signature of ancient human presence. An old man in the village pointed him in a direction. A boy was sent to guide him. And now, as the light fades, Schmidt crests a ridge and stops. In front of him rises a large mound, reddish soil, depressions and rises, the geometry of something beneath the surface. And there, sticking out of the ground, are the unmistakable upper edges of enormous T-shaped stone slabs. Every other archaeologist who had seen this place had called them grave markers. Klaus Schmidt looked at them and felt something else entirely. He knew immediately. This was not a cemetery. This was a beginning. To understand why Göbekli Tepe matters so profoundly, we first need to understand the world in which it was built. Because when you grasp the true conditions under which these stones were raised, the tools that existed, the way people lived, what they ate, how they organized themselves, the achievement becomes not merely impressive but almost incomprehensible. It becomes the kind of thing that makes you want to sit down quietly and rethink everything. We are talking about approximately 9,600 BCE. The last ice age had only recently, in geological terms, released its grip on the northern hemisphere. The great glaciers that had pressed down on Europe and much of Asia were retreating northward, and as they did, the climate was changing rapidly. Temperatures were rising. Vegetation was returning to regions that had been barren steppe. Rivers were finding new courses. Lakes were forming and shifting. The landscape itself was in a state of transformation that no single human lifetime could fully witness, but which generation after generation would have felt in the subtle shifts of season, in the animals that appeared and disappeared, in the movement of water and the growth of forests. The people who would eventually build Göbekli Tepe lived during what archaeologists call the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, a name that tells you everything about what they did not yet have. No pottery. This means no fired clay vessels. They could not store large quantities of liquid in sealed containers. They had no bowls that could survive everyday use and cleaning. They prepared food in stone mortars, cooked over open fires, used baskets woven from plant fibers and vessels carved from stone. The absence of pottery is not a minor detail. It defines an entire technological horizon, the edge of a world before a particular kind of storage and cooking became possible. And no agriculture. At least not in the way we understand the word today. The communities of this period were hunter-gatherers, people who moved through the landscape following the rhythms of wild animals and wild plants, harvesting what nature produced without planting or cultivating it in any systematic way. They knew the land intimately, with a depth of knowledge that most modern people have entirely lost. They knew which plants flowered at which time of year, which hillsides sheltered game during winter, where gazelle herds would pass in the seasonal migrations, where wild cereals like einkorn wheat grew thickly in the late spring. They were not primitive. They were experts. Their expertise was just of a radically different kind than ours. In the region of what is now southeastern Turkey, ancient Upper Mesopotamia, the land between the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, the landscape in 9600 BCE was considerably more lush than it is today. The Jermish mountain range, where Göbekli Tepe would be built on its highest ridge, was surrounded by woodland and grassland. There were gazelles, aurochs, the wild ancestors of modern cattle, red deer, wild boar, and a host of smaller animals. The rivers ran with fish. Wild pistachios, almonds, and emmer wheat grew across the hillsides. This was the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent, and it was genuinely fertile. A rich, diverse, and productive landscape that could support relatively dense populations of mobile people without requiring any form of cultivation. But there is a crucial distinction to make. Even in this relatively abundant environment, the people who lived here were small-scale communities. Not tiny, wandering bands of a dozen people stumbling through the wilderness. That romantic and rather condescending image from old textbooks has been largely revised. Recent research suggests these groups were semi-sedentary, moving between known locations seasonally, returning year after year to the same camps and meeting places. They had social networks that extended across wide regions. They shared symbols, traded materials like obsidian over distances of hundreds of kilometers, and maintained relationships with neighboring communities that were both cooperative and competitive. But still, they were not farmers. They did not have cities. They did not have kings or scribes or soldiers. They did not have a food surplus large enough, in any conventional economic sense, to free up large numbers of workers to spend years on a monumental construction project. And yet, at around 9600 BCE, they began to build Göbekli Tepe. The site itself sits at the highest point of a long limestone ridge, about 15 kilometers northeast of the modern city of Sanliurfa, ancient Urfa, a city long associated in local tradition with the prophet Abraham, itself one of the oldest continuously inhabited cities on Earth. From the ridge where Göbekli Tepe stands, you can see for an enormous distance in all directions. The Harran Plain stretches out to the south, a wide, flat expanse that even today is one of Turkey's most productive agricultural zones. The Taurus Mountains rise in the north. On a clear day, the view extends for 50 kilometers or more. Whatever purpose the site served, its location was deliberate. This was a place meant to be seen and to see from. The hill itself, which the local Kurdish population had long called Jair Marazin or Wish Hill, because it was considered a sacred place long before anyone knew why, rises 15 meters above the surrounding plateau. It covers approximately 8 hectares. Before the modern excavations, it appeared as a rounded, natural-looking mound, its true nature hidden by millennia of accumulated earth and stone. Farmers had been plowing its slopes for generations, occasionally turning up large rocks that they moved to the edges of their fields without understanding what they were. These were the tops of prehistoric pillars. The site we are visiting tonight was built over a long span of time. The earliest confirmed construction dates to around 9500 BCE, and the site was actively used until approximately 8000 BCE, a period of roughly 1500 years. That is longer than the entire span of the Roman Empire. Within that vast stretch of time, the builders and their descendants raised structure after structure, each generation adding to what came before, each enclosure built in relationship to the ones already standing. The accumulation of all this building activity is literally what created the hill. Göbekli Tepe is, in a very real sense, a man-made mountain, its height and form the result of centuries of construction and intentional filling in. This is a detail worth sitting with for a moment. This very landscape that archaeologists would one day excavate, the hill that would baffle them with its age and its ambition, was itself a human creation. The people who built here did not simply inhabit a natural feature of the terrain. They created the terrain. They shaped the earth. And they did so without metal, without the wheel, without the plow, and without, as far as we can tell, any system of government capable of organizing large-scale compulsory labor. The world of 9600 BC, then, was not the simple, small, economically impoverished world that generations of textbooks described. It was a world of sophisticated knowledge, complex social bonds, wide-ranging trade, and, as Göbekli Tepe makes absolutely clear, enormous collective spiritual ambition. The capacity for all of it was already there, in those remarkable early human communities who looked out over the Harran Plain and decided that what the world needed, what they needed, was a sanctuary. It is worth pausing for a moment on the geographical context that made this corner of the ancient world particularly significant. The Fertile Crescent, that arc of mild climate and productive land stretching from the Persian Gulf up through what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and into southern Turkey, was, in the 10th millennium BCE, one of the most biologically rich regions on Earth. The wild ancestors of most of the world's major crop plants grew here. The wild einkorn and emmer wheats, the wild barley, the wild lentils and chickpeas and flax. The wild ancestors of most of our major domesticated animals lived here too. The auroch that would become cattle, the wild boar that would become pigs, the mouflon that would become sheep, the bezoar ibex that would become goats. This was, in the most literal sense, a land of future possibility, a landscape in which the biological raw material for the agricultural revolution was already present, waiting only for the cultural and social conditions that would drive its transformation. Göbekli Tepe sits at the northern apex of this crescent, in the foothills of the Taurus Mountains where the Fertile Crescent reaches its most elevated and dramatic landscape. From this position, it overlooked a territory of extraordinary potential, a territory that would, within a few thousand years, become the birthplace of the first farms, the first permanent villages, and the first cities in human history. The people who built here were not in some peripheral backwater of prehistory. They were at the center of the world's most consequential transformation, and Göbekli Tepe was their monument to the fact that they understood it. Now let us look more closely at how we found it. Every great discovery has a prehistory, a long chain of near misses, wrong turns, and overlooked moments that leads up to the instant of recognition. The story of how Göbekli Tepe was found is one of the most compelling and slightly maddening such stories in the history of archaeology, because the site was, in a sense, found and then immediately lost again, not through theft or disaster, but simply because the people who saw it first did not understand what they were seeing. To understand that story, we need to go back much further than 1994 and Klaus Schmidt. We need to go back at least 10 millennia to the moment when the site was buried. Sometime around 8000 BCE, or perhaps a little later, Göbekli Tepe began to go underground. Over the course of what archaeologists believe was an extended process, not a single dramatic event but a gradual, deliberate action carried out over perhaps many generations. The great circular enclosures were filled in. Limestone rubble was brought in. Animal bones, the debris of feasting, flint tools, and the accumulated residue of human activity were used to pack the enclosures solid. The massive T-shaped pillars, some of them standing over 5 meters tall, were slowly swallowed by this fill, and eventually the whole complex disappeared from view. This act of deliberate burial, and there is still ongoing scholarly debate about exactly how deliberate it was, a point we will return to later, was one of the most consequential things the builders ever did, because it preserved everything. The fill that entombed the enclosures also protected them from weathering, from later human interference, from the slow erosion of wind and rain. The carvings on the pillars were kept in extraordinary condition. The floors remained intact. The bones that had fallen during the site's centuries of use lay exactly where they had fallen, waiting. Above the buried sanctuary, life continued. Smaller, later Neolithic settlements were built on and around the mound. Pottery-using communities came and went. Bronze Age people passed through the region. Iron Age kingdoms rose and fell. Alexander the Great's armies marched past these hills. The Roman Empire extended its borders to within a short distance. Byzantine Christianity transformed the region's culture. The Arab conquest brought Islam. The Seljuks, the Mongols, the Crusaders, the Ottomans, all of them lived and fought and died in this part of the world, and all of them walked over and around the buried hill without any idea of what lay beneath their feet. By the medieval period, the local population had given the hill its Kurdish name meaning Wish Hill, and maintained a vague ancestral sense that it was a special place. A mulberry tree, a wishing tree, in the local tradition, grew at the highest point of the mound, and people would still tie cloths to its branches and offer prayers, as if some deep collective memory persisted of the hill's ancient significance. But the specific knowledge of what lay below was entirely gone. It had been gone for so long that it might as well have never existed. Then came 1963. The University of Istanbul and the University of Chicago launched a joint prehistoric survey of southeastern Anatolia, a large-scale archaeological mapping project intended to catalog sites across the region. One of the surveyors was an American archaeologist named Peter Benedict. In the summer of 1963, Benedict's team passed through the Sanliurfa area and noted the hill we know as Göbekli Tepe in their records. Benedict described what he saw: a cluster of reddish mounds separated by depressions, scattered with flint artifacts on the surface, with what appeared to be 2 small cemeteries on the highest points, recognizable by the flat limestone slabs that jutted from the soil. He noted it. He cataloged it. He moved on. Benedict's identification of the stone slabs as Islamic grave markers was not an unreasonable mistake. The region was full of old cemeteries, and flat limestone slabs were often used as grave markers in the Islamic tradition. He correctly recognized the flint tools on the surface as belonging to the Neolithic period. But he had no framework for imagining that those stone slabs might be something else entirely: the exposed tops of 11,000-year-old T-shaped monoliths, the crowns of pillars that extended meters down into the earth below. And so Göbekli Tepe was noted in a survey report and then effectively forgotten, filed away in the academic archives as a minor Neolithic site of no particular significance. The survey's attention turned to other sites discovered during the same project, most notably Kaonu Tepesi, a rich Neolithic settlement near the city of Diyarbakir, and Göbekli Tepe vanished from archaeological consciousness for another 31 years. During those 31 years, a great deal was happening in the field of Near Eastern prehistory. Excavations at sites including Helen Semi, Kafer Hoyuk, Jerf El Amar, and most importantly Navali Kori were revealing the remarkable complexity of pre-pottery Neolithic cultures in southeastern Anatolia and northern Syria. Navali Kori, in particular, a site near the modern town of Hilvan, was producing extraordinary results. Excavations there between 1983 and 1991, led by the German archaeologist Harald Hauptmann, uncovered a settlement with rectangular domestic buildings that also featured something unprecedented in the Neolithic world: a special building with T-shaped stone pillars and elaborate sculptures. There were stone heads with snakes emerging from them. There were abstracted human figures. There was a totem pole-like carved column. Everything about the cult building at Navali Kori suggested that the people of the pre-pottery Neolithic had a rich, complex, and symbolically sophisticated inner life that no previous discovery had hinted at. Klaus Schmidt was a member of the team at Navali Kori. He was a young German prehistorian who had studied at the universities of Erlangen and Heidelberg, completing his doctorate in 1983 under Hauptmann himself. He had grown up intellectually within this tradition of Near Eastern archaeology, and he was deeply shaped by the Navali Kori discoveries. But in 1991, the excavation at Navali Kori came to a sudden and irreversible end. The site was flooded by the rising waters of the Ataturk Dam Reservoir, as part of Turkey's massive Southeast Anatolia project hydroelectric scheme. The site was gone. Not destroyed by time or looters, but deliberately inundated in the service of modernity. Schmidt watched it disappear beneath the water, preserved now only in photographs and excavation records. This loss made him determined. If there were sites like Navali Kori out there, sites with T-shaped pillars and elaborate carvings, sites that might tell us something profound about the inner world of prehistoric humanity, he wanted to find them before they too were destroyed. He began to survey the Sanliurfa region, consulting the literature, visiting known sites, asking questions in villages about hills with flint. And in October 1994, following an old man's directions and walking through the basaltstrein landscape with a taxi driver, a local guide, and a colleague from Heidelberg named Michael Morsch, he arrived at the foot of the reddish mound called Göbekli Tepe. Schmidt's own account of that moment is striking. He described the terrain as difficult. The basalt field was hard to walk through, and his group was beginning to doubt the wisdom of the excursion. No archaeological traces were visible. Then they cleared the basalt field and reached the limestone plateau, and there ahead of them the mound rose above the flat ground. And sticking out of the earth at its summit were those flat-topped stone slabs that Peter Benedict had mistaken for grave markers 31 years earlier. But Schmidt had spent years working at Navali Kori. He had touched and studied T-shaped pillars. He knew the moment he saw these stones what they were. He recognized the characteristic shape, that distinctive horizontal slab atop a vertical shaft, the geometry that every other observer had found inexplicable and dismissed. He did not dismiss it. He crouched down, looked at the exposed stone, and understood. Only humans could have created something like this, he later wrote. He was back in 1995 with a full excavation team. The discovery of Göbekli Tepe was, in this sense, a double discovery. First the physical finding of the site, and then the intellectual recognition of its nature. The physical finding had happened in 1963. The intellectual recognition waited 31 years for a man with the right combination of knowledge, curiosity, and willingness to overturn received wisdom. Without Schmidt's prior experience at Navali Kori, it might have waited 31 more. The excavations began in the spring of 1995 as a cooperative project between Schmidt, the Sanliurfa Museum under director Adnan Mazur, and the German Archaeological Institute under Harald Hauptmann. A first test trench was opened at the southeastern slope, where a modern pit had already cut through an ancient terrazzo floor, A floor made of burnt lime, polished smooth, exactly the kind of carefully finished surface that would not belong to a cemetery but would be entirely at home in a substantial communal building. What came out of the ground in those first weeks, and in the seasons that followed, was beyond anything that Schmidt or his colleagues had expected. It was beyond anything anyone had expected. The world was about to meet something it was not prepared for. Imagine for a moment that you are standing inside one of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe as it looked during its active use, sometime around 9500 BC. You are inside a roughly circular space, perhaps 20 or 25 meters across, enclosed by thick stone walls made of roughly fitted limestone blocks. Around the interior perimeter of this space, set into the walls or standing just in front of them, are a series of great T-shaped pillars, perhaps 10 or 12 of them, arranged in a ring. They are carved from local limestone, yellowish-white in the early morning light, and they stand between 3 and 4 meters tall, taller than any person, taller than two people, their horizontal tops looming over the space like stone capitals without their columns. And at the very center of the enclosure, dominating everything, are two pillars that are even larger than the rest. These central pillars reach up to 5.5 meters in height. They weigh, depending on the enclosure, anywhere from 10 to 40 tons. They do not carry roofing beams or support any obvious structural function. They stand alone, paired, facing each other across the center of the circle, and they are the most elaborately carved stones in the enclosure. These central pillars are not simply rectangular posts. They have a distinctive and unique form. The horizontal slab at the top, the bar of the T, is slightly wider than the shaft, and if you look at the lower portions of some pillars, you see something that fundamentally changes how you understand them. Carved arms. Long human arms, bent at the elbows, running along the sides of the pillar shaft. Below the arms, carved in low relief, are hands, and sometimes a belt, and below the belt, in a few examples, a loincloth or a foxbelt apron hanging from the waist. These pillars are not abstract architectural elements. They are people, or something that represents people. The T-shape, red in profile, is a human body. The horizontal slab is the head and shoulders seen from the front. The shaft is the torso, the carved arms are arms, and the implied lower body continues downward. These are, as Klaus Schmidt put it, highly abstracted depictions of the human body, a stylized, geometric representation of a figure that nonetheless unmistakably communicates its humanity. Whether these figures represent actual people, revered ancestors, perhaps, or shamanistic leaders who had been transformed into stone guardians of the sacred space, or supernatural beings, deities, or cosmological forces, is something we cannot know with certainty. But the intention to represent something humanoid, something with a body and arms and an identity, is clear. The pillars are not mere structural elements. They are presences. Standing inside the enclosure, surrounded by these silent, towering figures, each with its carved animal imagery, you would have been surrounded by a crowd of stone beings, each one watching. Now let us talk about the animals. Because the animals are everywhere and they are astonishing. Carved into the surfaces of the pillars, sometimes in high relief, projecting dramatically from the stone, sometimes in shallow bas-relief that catches the light at a low angle, are images of the wild creatures of the ancient Near East. The variety is extraordinary. There are snakes, sinuous, flowing, sometimes arranged in groups of 12 or more, moving in parallel patterns that create an almost hypnotic wave effect across the stone surface. There are foxes, dozens of them, sharp-featured and alert, depicted often with an erect posture that suggests menace or power. There are wild boars, their bristled backs arched, their tusks prominent. There are gazelles, aurochs, ducks, cranes, vultures, scorpions, spiders, insects. There are lions, their teeth bared. There are the great hoofed creatures of the steppe. The animals are depicted with remarkable naturalism. These are not crude scratches or simple geometric animals. They are carefully observed, dynamically posed, and individually characterized. A fox bares its teeth. A predator crouches over its prey. A vulture extends one great wing. Cranes move in formation. The sculptors who made these carvings had spent their lives observing these animals, hunting them, living alongside them, and their knowledge shows in every curved line and every confidently rendered form. What is particularly striking about the animal imagery is what it does not include. The animals carved at Göbekli Tepe are almost never deer. Deer were a primary food source for the people of this period. Bones at the site include substantial quantities of deer remains, yet deer appear almost nowhere in the carvings. Instead, the depicted animals are predominantly those that are dangerous, powerful, or symbolically charged. Predators, venomous creatures, birds associated with death. The choice seems deliberate, purposeful. These are not pictures of the daily menu. they are something else. A symbolic world, a cosmological vocabulary rendered in stone, where certain animals carry meanings that the carvers and their audience understood and we can now only guess at. There are also, intriguingly, a small number of human figures. These are rare, far rarer than the animals, and they appear in unusual contexts. One of the most famous is on Pillar 43 in Enclosure D, often called the vulture stone by researchers. This pillar carries one of the most complex and narratively dense compositions at the site. A headless human figure depicted with an erect phallus, crouching beneath an enormous scorpion, while above and around this scene are arranged a vulture with one wing extended, apparently holding up a round object that may be a head or a sun or both, along with other birds and creatures. The headless human is not alone. The theme of the headless figure appears in scattered contexts at the site, suggesting something specific about the beliefs of these people regarding death, transformation, and the relationship between the human and divine worlds. The scope cult is one of the more arresting aspects of Göbekli Tepe's religious life. In 2017, a team of researchers announced the discovery of several human skull fragments at the site, all bearing artificial modifications unlike anything seen elsewhere in the Neolithic world. The skulls had been carefully cut, perforated, and scored with deep incisions. In one case, a groove ran down the back of the skull in a pattern that would have allowed it to hang, suspended, like a framed picture or a sacred object on display. This is the earliest evidence ever found of skull curation, the deliberate preservation and display of human remains, and it places Göbekli Tepe in a tradition of ancestor veneration or ritual engagement with the dead that would echo through Neolithic cultures across the ancient world for thousands of years. Plastered skulls were found later at Jericho. Skull imagery pervades the walls of Catalhoyuk. But at Göbekli Tepe, the practice appears in its earliest known form. Now consider the engineering challenge that all of this represents. The pillars were not carved in place. They were quarried from the limestone bedrock of the adjacent plateau. There is an unfinished pillar still lying in the quarry, partially carved, estimated to weigh 50 tons, abandoned mid-creation for reasons unknown, and then transported up the slope to the summit and raised upright. The quarrying was done with stone tools and flint-tipped instruments, which means that the carving of these enormous limestone blocks, some of them several meters long and many tons in weight, was accomplished entirely without metal, chisels of flint, hammers of stone, patient, skilled, repetitive labor. The transportation of the pillars, which were quarried a few hundred meters from the construction sites, required coordinated human effort on a considerable scale. Experiments with similar megaliths, the Moai of Easter Island, for instance, or the standing stones at Stonehenge, have suggested that moving a stone of this size required anything from 20 to several hundred people, depending on the technique used and the terrain. Schmidt estimated, drawing on these comparisons, that moving the Göbekli Tepe pillars would have required hundreds of workers. More recent experimental archaeology has suggested that smaller teams, perhaps 12 to 24 people using ropes, leveraging, and possibly water or other lubricants, might have managed the smaller pillars. But the central pillars of the largest enclosures, the great paired stones at the heart of each circle, would have required significantly greater effort. Either way, whether it was hundreds of workers or a smaller, more skilled crew, this was not work that could be accomplished alone or in small family groups. It required coordination, planning, communication, and a shared commitment to a goal that extended far beyond immediate survival. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were organized. They were directed. And they were motivated by something powerful enough to make them undertake, over and over again across 15 centuries, the enormous labor of raising stone. As of 2021, archaeologists have excavated approximately 10% of the site. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed at least 20 additional enclosures still buried beneath the mound. The four main excavated enclosures, labeled A, B, C, and D, represent only the visible tip of what is buried here. Enclosure D, the largest and oldest, is 30 meters across and contains some of the most impressive and most ancient pillars on the site. It was this enclosure that yielded the radiocarbon date of 9,530 BCE, currently the oldest known radiocarbon date from the entire site, placing the beginning of monumental construction here at roughly 11,500 years ago. As the enclosures were built and used and eventually buried and built over, the architecture underwent changes. The oldest enclosures from the pre-pottery Neolithic A period, the 10th millennium BCE, are the large circular structures with the tallest, most elaborately carved pillars. These are the ones that most capture the imagination. Later enclosures from the pre-pottery Neolithic B period, the 9th millennium BCE, are smaller and more rectangular in plan, their pillars less massive, their carvings simpler. There is a trajectory visible here, a change over time. Though what drove that change, whether it reflects shifts in belief, in social organization, in population, or in the site's role within a broader regional ritual landscape, we cannot say with confidence. Let us try to imagine the construction process from the beginning, with the tools and knowledge actually available to the builders, and see what it tells us about them. The limestone from which the pillars were made is a relatively soft stone by geological standards, dense enough to last millennia when undisturbed, but workable with the hard flint tools available to pre-pottery Neolithic craftspeople. The quarry from which most of the pillars were extracted lies on the lower southwestern slope of the hill, only a few hundred meters from the main construction area. This proximity was not accidental. The builders chose to build at a location where good quality limestone was close at hand. In the quarry, you can still see the marks of their work. Channels cut around the base of emerging pillars, the lines of flint tool percussion that defined the boundaries of the stone to be extracted. The unfinished pillar lying there, still partially embedded in the bedrock, gives us a direct window into the extraction process. It was carved from above while still attached to the bedrock below, the sides shaped and the surfaces smoothed, before the connecting stone at the base would have been cut through to free the pillar for transport. The flint tools used for this work have been found in enormous quantities across the site: scrapers, burins, blades, and cores in the thousands. These are not crude implements. They are the products of a sophisticated lithic technology, tools made with a precise understanding of how flint fractures and how force can be directed through stone to produce specific shapes. The knappers who made them were themselves skilled artisans, and the tools they produced were the precision instruments of a prehistoric craft industry. This was not Stone Age work in the disparaging sense the phrase sometimes implies. It was the application of deep material knowledge and refined technique to the task of shaping an environment. The transport of the pillars from quarry to construction site was accomplished uphill, over uneven terrain, without wheeled vehicles or draft animals. Recent experimental work has suggested that a combination of ropes, wooden sledges, and perhaps water or another lubricant applied to the ground could allow relatively small groups, perhaps a dozen to 20 people, to move pillars of the smaller variety. The largest central pillars, which weigh 10 tons or more, would have required significantly more effort and ingenuity. But the point is not that it was not easy. The point is that it was done repeatedly over 15 centuries by people who had every other survival concern pressing on them simultaneously, and who chose to invest this extraordinary effort in building something that served no immediate practical function. That was not a house, not a granary, not a defensive wall, but a place of meaning. What was it like to be inside one of these enclosures during its years of active use? We can only speculate, but the speculation is grounded in the physical evidence. The enclosed space would have created a distinctive acoustic environment, stone walls reflecting and focusing sound, so that voices and drums and whatever instruments might have been played would have resonated in ways that an open-air space does not. Many ancient ritual sites are now understood to have been designed, at least partly, for their acoustic properties. The chambers of Maltepe's temples, for instance, produce resonant frequencies that have measurable effects on human consciousness. Whether the builders of Göbekli Tepe were aware of or intended such acoustic effects, we cannot say, but the possibility is worth noting. The visual experience within the enclosures would have been dominated by the carved pillars, those silent, towering presences covered in their dense imagery. In firelight, with shadows moving across the carved surfaces, the animals would have seemed almost to move, the snakes writhing, the foxes leaping, the vultures spreading their wings. The effect would have been profoundly immersive, enveloping. Surrounded by these images, in the flickering firelight, with the sounds of ceremony and perhaps the taste of fermented grain on the tongue, the boundaries between the human world and the symbolic world encoded in the carvings may have felt permeable in ways that are difficult to recapture in the harsh clarity of modern daylight. What was it like to be inside one of these enclosures during its years of active use? We can only speculate, but the speculation is grounded in the physical evidence. This was a space designed to be overwhelming, a space designed to make you feel small and part of something immense simultaneously. A space designed to bring you face to face with the symbols that organized your world and gave it meaning. In that sense, in the specific sense of being a human-made environment constructed for the purpose of inducing a particular quality of experience, it is recognizable across the vast distance of 11,000 years. You have been in spaces designed to do this. So has everyone who has ever stood in a cathedral or walked through a great mosque, or sat in the darkness of a Japanese Zen garden, or entered any of the hundreds of thousands of sacred spaces that human beings have built across the world and across time for exactly this purpose: to step outside the ordinary and encounter something that feels, however briefly, like the whole. What was it like to be inside one of these enclosures during its years of active use? We can only speculate, but the speculation is grounded in the physical evidence. The site was conceived, built, and used by people who cared profoundly, practically, demonstrably about creating the conditions for that encounter. And that is something we understand even now from the inside. What we can say is that the site was, for its builders, a living space in every sense, a place that grew and changed and was continually remade generation after generation, as each community of builders added their own structures, their own pillars, their own carvings to the accumulated sacred geography of the hill. When Klaus Schmidt first interpreted Göbekli Tepe, he was working with an intellectual framework that had been dominant in Near Eastern archaeology for decades. The idea that the site was used by hunter-gatherers who had no permanent presence there, who traveled in from the surrounding region for periodic rituals and construction events and then dispersed back into the landscape. In this picture, a picture that was compelling and exciting in its own right, Göbekli Tepe was a sacred gathering place for mobile communities, a pilgrimage destination that attracted people from perhaps 100 kilometers or more away, who came together, built, feasted, performed rituals, and then left. This interpretation was supported by several lines of evidence. The animal bones found at the site, tens of thousands of them, the remains of enormous feasting, came from wild game, gazelles, deer, aurochs, boar, ducks, cranes. No domestic animals. No domesticated plants. The flint tools scattered across the site were the kinds of tools associated with hunting and the processing of wild resources. And for a long time, the absence of clear domestic architecture, of the small, modest buildings in which people actually lived their daily lives, suggested that nobody had set up housekeeping on this particular hill. But the picture has been getting more complicated over the past decade. Recent excavations have found what appear to be domestic structures at Göbekli Tepe, smaller, more modest buildings that look less like sacred enclosures and more like actual houses. Grinding stones, found in large quantities across the site, and analysis of plant remains preserved in the soil, suggest that considerable cereal processing was going on here. The phytoliths, microscopic plant signatures preserved in the soil, indicate that wild cereals were being ground in large quantities. Water management features, including carved stone cisterns and channels, suggest that someone was thinking about permanent infrastructure. The picture that is now emerging is not of a purely non-residential sanctuary visited seasonally by nomads, but of a site where at least some people lived, at least some of the time, alongside the monumental enclosures. This does not necessarily negate the idea of a sacred gathering place. The two ideas are not mutually exclusive. A site could be both a place of ritual pilgrimage and a place where a permanent or semi-permanent community lived and maintained the sacred structures. Many ancient pilgrimage centers had resident populations of priests, caretakers, and craftspeople alongside the seasonal influx of worshippers and pilgrims. But it does complicate the portrait of Göbekli Tepe as a purely temporary gathering place. What we can reconstruct about the people themselves comes from several sources. The material culture they left behind, the zooarchaeological evidence of what they hunted and ate, the spatial distribution of finds across the site, and comparisons with contemporary sites in the region that give us a richer picture of pre-pottery Neolithic life in Upper Mesopotamia. The people of the Göbekli Tepe period were part of a broad cultural sphere that archaeologists call the Taz Tepeli culture, from the Turkish Four Stone Hills, a name that has been applied to the entire network of related pre-pottery Neolithic sites scattered across the Sanliurfa region and beyond. This culture is distinguished by its characteristic T-shaped pillars, its elaborate stone sculpture, its skull curation practices, and its rich tradition of animal iconography. The distribution of this cultural tradition, the area over which the same symbolic vocabulary, the same architectural forms, and the same material culture appear, extends across a radius of roughly 200 kilometers. Tools made from obsidian sourced from distant volcanic deposits in central and eastern Anatolia have been found at Göbekli Tepe, evidence of exchange networks that reached far beyond the local region. From a distance of 200 kilometers, people brought materials to this site. Some of those people may have brought themselves. Zooarchaeological analysis of the animal bones at Göbekli Tepe has revealed something fascinating about the timing of gatherings at the site. Gazelles appear in the faunal record only seasonally. They were migratory animals in this period, present in the region only during certain months. The massive concentrations of gazelle bones at the site suggest that the largest communal events, the great feasts that left behind hundreds of cubic meters of butchered animal remains, were timed to coincide with the seasonal migrations, the moments when gazelles were passing through the region in large numbers and could be hunted in quantity. This implies sophisticated planning and coordination. Groups from across the wider region would have needed to know in advance when and where to come together, which in turn implies some form of regular communication and social organization capable of coordinating activities across large distances. The people who built Göbekli Tepe were, in short, much more socially complex than the old stereotype of the primitive hunter-gatherer allows. They had specialists. The highly skilled craftspeople who produced the carved pillars could not have been mere generalists who picked up a chisel once a year. The quality and consistency of the carving, maintained across centuries and across dozens of different pillars, implies a tradition of specialized craft knowledge transmitted from one generation to the next. It implies something we might call teaching. It implies something we might call craft guilds, or at the very least, dedicated practitioners whose identity and social role was bound up with the production of these extraordinary objects. They almost certainly had ritual specialists, what we might call priests or shamans, though both words carry implications that may not precisely fit a prehistoric context. But the complexity of the site, the symbolic depth of its imagery, and the multi-generational continuity of its construction all point to the existence of people whose role was to maintain, interpret, and transmit the sacred knowledge that the site embodied. These are not the kinds of sites that arise spontaneously without anyone in charge of their meaning. They had a social hierarchy of some kind. The very fact that some members of the community spent their time carving stone pillars rather than hunting or gathering food implies that others were producing or contributing enough food to sustain them. Whoever directed the large-scale construction work, whoever organized the bringing together of hundreds of workers, the feast that fed them, the quarrying and transport of the stones, had some form of authority. Whether this authority was rooted in spiritual prestige, in genealogical inheritance, in demonstrated skill, or in some combination of these things we cannot say. But it existed. And they were deeply, richly, elaborately concerned with the spiritual world. The evidence for this is everywhere at Göbekli Tepe, in the sheer scale of the investment in the sacred enclosures, in the complexity and care of the carvings, in the skull cult, in the careful selection of which animals to depict and how. Whatever these people believed, whatever cosmological story they told themselves about the world, about death and what came after, about the relationship between the human and the animal and the divine, it was sufficient to motivate an extraordinary collective enterprise that lasted for 1500 years. We should be careful here about projecting modern categories of religion onto a prehistoric context. The word religion carries a specific weight in our world. It implies doctrine, institution, hierarchy, text, and formal distinction from other aspects of life like politics, economics, or science. None of these distinctions would have made sense to the builders of Göbekli Tepe. Their spiritual life was not separate from their economic life or their social life or their relationship with the natural world. It was woven through all of it, inseparable from the seasonal rhythms of hunting, the social bonds of kinship, the negotiation of relationships with neighboring communities. When they gathered at Göbekli Tepe, they were not leaving behind their ordinary lives to enter a sacred space. They were living their whole lives, fully and completely, in a world that was always already sacred. Let us dwell on the texture of daily life for these people because it is easy to abstract them into archaeological abstractions, pre-pottery Neolithic age communities, or mobile forager groups, and lose sight of the fact that they were fully human beings with families, friendships, fears, and memories. They woke in the morning to the sound of wind over limestone, to the smell of a fire burning low, to the sounds of the people sleeping around them. They were cold in winter and swelteringly hot in the long summer months when temperatures on the Anatolian plateau climbed well above 40 degrees Celsius. They knew hunger, and they knew the particular satisfaction of a successful hunt, of meat roasting and fat dripping into a fire. They fell in love, they grieved their dead, they told stories to their children in the dark. Their children grew up knowing the landscape around them with an intimacy that most modern people never achieve with any place. Every hillside, every seasonal stream, every cave and rock shelter in the territory their community ranged over was known, named, remembered, associated with events and stories and practical knowledge. Where the best flint was found for toolmaking. Where the wild pistachios grew thickest in the late summer. Which spring dried up in the dry months and which ran year-round. Where the gazelle herds passed in autumn and in spring. This was the kind of knowledge that kept you alive, and it was passed from parent to child, from elder to apprentice, with the same seriousness that a modern university passes on chemistry or law. They were also artisans. The stone tools found at Göbekli Tepe, many thousands of them scattered across the site from the ridge to the slopes, are made with remarkable skill. The flint knapping required to produce a fine blade or a precisely shaped projectile point is a demanding craft, one that takes years to learn and a lifetime to master. The knappers who made these tools were specialists in their material, able to read a nodule of flint at a glance and visualize the shapes that could be drawn out of it. And the sculptors who carved the T-shaped pillars, those individuals whose work has lasted 11,000 years and will likely last 11,000 more, were masters of a different but related art, able to work with stone picks and limestone rubble to produce results that are not merely functional but beautiful. There is no word for artist in pre-pottery Neolithic, no equivalent of the modern distinction between craftsperson and creator. But whatever we call the individuals who carved the fox on Pillar 27, the vulture on Pillar 43, the flowing serpents of Enclosure A, they were people for whom the making of images mattered profoundly, who brought skill and intention and what we can only call aesthetic judgment to their work. We can see the evidence of their choices in every image, the particular way a fox's teeth are bared, the dynamic three-dimensionality of a predator lunging from a pillar surface, the rhythmic precision of a row of snakes carved in parallel. These were choices made by a human mind that cared about beauty and meaning in the same moment. The social world in which all of this happened was also far richer than the old textbook picture allows. The ethnographic record of hunter-gatherer societies around the world reveals communities that are deeply embedded in webs of obligation, relationship, and mutual aid, not the anarchic free-for-all of popular imagination, but carefully organized social structures built around kinship, alliance, and the management of shared resources. Marriage rules created bonds between communities. Shared ritual practices created obligations of hospitality and mutual assistance. The exchange of valued objects, including, at Göbekli Tepe, obsidian from volcanic sources hundreds of kilometers away, created and maintained long-distance relationships that were simultaneously economic, social, and political. In this context, a gathering site like Göbekli Tepe served functions far beyond the simply ritual. It was a place where communities could meet potential marriage partners from outside their immediate group, vital for maintaining the genetic health of small populations. It was a place where disputes could be adjudicated in the presence of witnesses from multiple communities. It was a place where information could be exchanged about the location of game, the movement of peoples, the availability of specific resources. It was, in every meaningful sense, a hub, a node in the network through which the complex social world of the pre-pottery Neolithic was organized and maintained. The physical construction of the site was itself a social act of enormous significance. The act of building together, of sharing the enormous labor of quarrying, transporting, and raising the pillars, created bonds between the participating groups that were reinforced by every hour of shared effort. Anthropologists have a term for this: costly signaling. When a community invests in something enormously expensive, in terms of time, labor, and resources, that investment is itself a signal of commitment, a demonstration that the community is serious about its relationships and obligations. The pillars at Göbekli Tepe, precisely because they were so hard to make, were the most powerful possible statement of the community's seriousness. We built this together. We invested this much together. We are committed to each other and to this place. This is, when you think about it, not so different from what large-scale collective projects have always done and still do. The medieval cathedrals of Europe required the investment of entire regional economies and the labor of multiple generations. The Great Wall of China bound together communities across thousands of kilometers. The pyramids of Egypt marshaled the resources of an entire civilization. In every case, the sheer scale of the undertaking was part of the message, a message about the seriousness, the permanence, and the legitimacy of the social order that produced it. Göbekli Tepe was the first known instance of this kind of communication, the first monumental statement of collective identity in the human archaeological record. It invented a language that humanity has been speaking ever since. There is a temptation, when we look at the carved pillars of Göbekli Tepe, to treat them as pictures, as illustrations that convey a literal scene or story. This is both understandable and misleading. The images on these pillars are not illustrations in any simple sense. They are a symbolic vocabulary, a system of meaningful signs whose precise grammar and semantics we do not have the key to decode. We are reading a language written in stone by people who left us no dictionary, no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual inscription. What we can do is observe patterns, make comparisons, and offer carefully qualified interpretations, always acknowledging that we may be wrong. With that caveat firmly in place, let us explore what the evidence suggests. The first and most striking observation is that each of the excavated enclosures appears to have a dominant animal. Enclosure A is associated above all with snakes, sinuous, proliferating snakes that wind across multiple pillars in complex patterns. Enclosure B features foxes prominently. Enclosure C has a more varied assemblage but with significant boar imagery. Enclosure D, the largest and oldest, contains the most complex and sophisticated carvings, including the famous vulture stone, Pillar 43, with its headless human and elaborate avian imagery. This pattern, one dominant animal per enclosure, has led some researchers to propose that each enclosure might have been associated with a particular social group, perhaps a clan or lineage, whose identity was defined in part by a particular totemic animal. If different clans or bands from across the wider region came to Göbekli Tepe at ritual gatherings, each might have built and maintained their own enclosure, their own space within the larger sacred complex, marked by the animal that defined them. The enclosures might then represent a kind of symbolic map of the social world, a concrete, architectural expression of the alliances and distinctions between different communities. This hypothesis is compelling but not proven. It is the kind of interpretation that makes intuitive sense given what we know about the social organization of forge or communities in general, but the specific evidence for it at Göbekli Tepe is suggestive rather than definitive. What the carvings tell us with more certainty is something about the relationship between the builders and the animal world. The animals depicted are not, as we noted, the animals most commonly eaten. Deer and fish, important dietary staples, are almost absent from the imagery. Instead, the carvings overwhelmingly feature animals that were powerful, dangerous, or symbolically loaded. Predators, venomous creatures, large and impressive wild animals. The fox, with its cunning and its nocturnal habits, its sharp features and its association with deception in many mythological traditions. The snake, universal symbol of transformation, death, and hidden knowledge. The vulture, the great eater of the dead, associated across ancient Near Eastern and Anatolian traditions with the afterlife and the transition of souls. The scorpion, venomous and feared. The lion, the apex predator. These are not the animals of the dinner table. They are the animals of the imagination, the creatures that people dreamed about, feared, invoked in ritual, wore a symbolic identity. They are what we might call the animals of power, and their presence on the pillars at Göbekli Tepe suggests that the site was a place where the community's relationship with power, with the wild, the dangerous, the transcendent forces of the natural world, was negotiated and made concrete. There is a fascinating observation that has been made about the sex and posture of the depicted animals. To the extent that the sex of the carved creatures can be identified, and it cannot always be determined, the animals at Göbekli Tepe are predominantly male, and they are often depicted in aggressive postures, teeth bared, bodies tense, postures of threat or dominance. The fox shows its teeth. The lion roars. The boar is alert and bristling. This is not a peaceful bestiary. It is a gallery of male energy in its most forceful expressions. The abstract symbols are equally intriguing. Alongside the representational animals, the pillars carry a vocabulary of geometric forms. H-shaped symbols, crescents, discs, and a particular symbol that looks somewhat like a pictograph, a form that some researchers have tentatively linked to early proto-writing, the first steps toward the kind of systematic symbolic notation that would eventually become writing proper in Mesopotamia, several thousand years later. Whether this is truly an early form of writing or simply a decorative or symbolic motif remains a subject of scholarly debate. One particularly fascinating piece of recent research concerns the V-shaped symbols found on several pillars at the site. A researcher named Martin Sweatman at the University of Edinburgh proposed in 2024 that these V symbols could represent individual days, and that an arrangement of them on one of the pillars constitutes a solar calendar of 365 days, divided into 12 lunar months plus 11 additional days, with the summer solstice marked as a special event. If this interpretation is correct, and it remains controversial, it would suggest that the builders of Göbekli Tepe possessed a sophisticated astronomical knowledge sufficient to track the year's length and identify the major solar events. It would push the origins of structured timekeeping back by thousands of years. Other researchers have offered different readings of the same symbols, and the matter remains unresolved. But the possibility is worth noting as an example of how much may yet be decoded from these carved stones. The relationship between the site and the sky has attracted considerable attention. Ground-penetrating radar surveys have revealed that the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe were laid out with a striking degree of geometric precision. A study published by researchers from the Israel Antiquities Authority found evidence that the builders used ropes, stretching them to desired shapes before marking out the enclosure walls, as a form of geometric planning. This implies knowledge of geometry, of spatial planning, and of construction techniques that went far beyond simple trial and error. The enclosures were not thrown together. They were carefully designed. Whether astronomical alignments were intentional is harder to determine. Several researchers have noted that certain enclosures appear to be oriented towards significant celestial events. The rising of particular stars, the direction of the solstice sunrise, the alignment of specific pillars with points on the horizon. Some of these proposed alignments are probably coincidental. The circularity of the enclosures means that some alignment with something in the sky is geometrically inevitable. But others have attracted more serious scholarly attention, and the possibility that Göbekli Tepe's builders were tracking the heavens as part of their cosmological system cannot be dismissed. Consider what the night sky would have looked like to these people. There was no electric light for hundreds of kilometers in any direction. The sky above the Heron Plain on a clear night would have been extraordinary, utterly black between the stars, the Milky Way a blazing river overhead, the planets moving their slow courses against the background of fixed stars. In a world without calendars or clocks, the sky was the most reliable timekeeper available, and its movements had immediate practical consequences. The rising of certain stars marked the return of particular seasons. The position of the moon told you how far into the month you were. The behavior of the Pleiades, the Orion constellation, the movements of Venus as morning and evening star. All of these were navigation tools for moving through time the way a map is a navigation tool for moving through space. Mesopotamia, the cultural cradle immediately downstream of Göbekli Tepe along the Euphrates and Tigris, would go on to develop some of the most sophisticated astronomical traditions of the ancient world. Babylonian astronomers by the first millennium BCE were tracking the movements of celestial bodies with extraordinary precision, predicting eclipses, identifying the planets, and embedding astronomical knowledge into their religious mythology in ways that have left traces in the astrological tradition still alive today. Whether the astronomical knowledge of Göbekli Tepe's builders was a direct ancestor of this Babylonian tradition, whether the tracking of the sky that may have begun on that limestone ridge eventually contributed to the star charts of Nineveh, cannot be established with the evidence currently available. But the geographical and temporal proximity is suggestive. The cultural networks that linked the communities of Upper Mesopotamia in the 10th millennium BCE extended, over the following thousands of years, into the great river valleys where the first writing, the first codified law, and the first urban civilizations would emerge. Whether the seeds of Babylonian astronomy were planted at Göbekli Tepe is a tantalizing question that may never be fully answered. What the symbolic world of Göbekli Tepe does tell us with certainty is that the capacity for abstract thinking, for encoding complex ideas in visual symbols, for building a shared system of meaning that is transmitted across time and space, was already fully developed in the pre-pottery Neolithic. This is perhaps the most important single thing the site has revealed, that the cognitive capacities we associate with civilization were not products of civilization. They existed before the city, before the farm, before writing or mathematics or law. They existed when people still tracked game across the limestone plateau and carved their understanding of the world into the bones of the earth itself. The H-shaped symbols and the crescents and the discs that appear alongside the animal imagery are not decorative afterthoughts. They form part of a visual language, a symbolic grammar, that was understood by the communities who used this site. We see similar abstract symbols appearing at other pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the region, at Navali Kori, at Karahan Tepe, at Seberg, and at other Tos Templar sites. The consistency of these symbols across a geographic spread of hundreds of kilometers suggests that they were meaningful in a shared way, that a person from one community who visited another's enclosure would have recognized the symbolic vocabulary encoded in the carvings, the way a literate person can read a text they did not write. There has been speculation, careful, qualified scholarly speculation, that these recurring symbols may represent the earliest stirrings of writing. Full writing, as we understand it, requires a system capable of representing spoken language in a one-to-one correspondence, specific signs for specific sounds or words. The symbols at Göbekli Tepe do not appear to have reached this level of systematization, but they may represent what linguists call proto-writing or semasiographic notation, a system of signs that communicates meaning without representing the sounds of speech. The H symbol may have meant something specific and consistent, perhaps a sacred place or a deity or a cosmological concept, that could be read by someone who knew the system, even if they would have rendered that meaning differently in spoken language. Such systems are known from many ancient cultures, and they often predate full writing by centuries or millennia. What all of this adds up to, the careful animal iconography, the geometric symbols, the astronomical orientation, the architectural precision, is a picture of people whose relationship with meaning and symbol was rich, layered, and systematic. They were not simply making pretty pictures on rocks. They were making a statement about their world, encoding a cosmological vision in stone so that it would endure, so that those who came after would be able to enter this space and encounter, through its imagery, the fundamental truths that the community lived by. We cannot read those truths directly, but we can feel their presence in the stones. Every visitor to Göbekli Tepe, whether in person or through the literature, eventually arrives at the same question. And it is perhaps the most profound question that any archaeological site has ever posed to humanity. What was this for? It is, on the surface, a simple question. What did these people use this place for? What happened inside these great stone circles? What were the rituals that filled these carved enclosures? The ceremonies that unfolded under the watch of the T-shaped pillar beings? But the more you probe the question, the more it expands, because it is not really a question about function in any narrow sense. It is a question about meaning. About what these people valued, what they feared, what they hoped for, and what they understood about their place in the universe. Klaus Schmidt's own interpretation, refined over nearly 20 years of excavation until his death in 2014, was that Göbekli Tepe was primarily a sacred site, a sanctuary, a temple complex, a place of ritual and ceremony. He argued, based on the absence of clear evidence for permanent residential occupation in the early excavations, that no one lived here permanently. Instead, different communities from across the wider region came together periodically, perhaps annually, perhaps seasonally, perhaps at irregular intervals tied to particular celestial or agricultural events, for massive communal gatherings that combined ritual activity with the physical labor of building and maintaining the enclosures. Schmidt compared the site to a cathedral on a hill, a place that people traveled to from great distances to participate in sacred ceremonies, bringing offerings and labor and returning to their ordinary lives afterward. The evidence for large-scale feasting is among the most compelling lines of support for this interpretation. Enclosure D alone contained nearly 500 cubic meters of fill, and packed into that fill were enormous quantities of animal bones, flint tools, and the debris of human activity. The bones show clear evidence of butchery and processing. Marrow bones had been smashed to extract the rich interior. The remains of gazelle, aurochs, red deer, and wild boar were present in quantities that point to repeated large-scale meat consumption. This was not everyday eating. This was feasting on a scale that implies gatherings of hundreds of people, perhaps many hundreds, coming together and consuming collectively. Adding a particular dimension to the feasting evidence is the discovery of stone vessels at the site, large basins carved from limestone, that Schmidt interpreted as containers for fermented beverages. The analysis of organic residues in these vessels has provided some chemical support for this idea, suggesting the processing of cereal-based liquids that could have been a beer-like drink. Wild cereals, the ancestors of domesticated wheat and barley, grew abundantly in the surrounding region, and if, as seems increasingly plausible, some cereal processing was happening at the site, the production of fermented grain beverages is not a far-fetched hypothesis. Researchers have found large limestone vessels at the site containing traces consistent with the fermentation process. Beer at Göbekli Tepe. The idea has attracted a certain amount of breathless coverage in the popular press, and one should be careful not to reduce the site's sacred character to a prehistoric happy hour. But the role of fermented beverages in ritual context is extraordinarily well documented across human cultures, and the possibility that altered states of consciousness were part of the ceremonial life at Göbekli Tepe is worth taking seriously. Anthropologists and archaeologists who study feasting have noted that shared meals, and especially shared intoxicants, are powerful tools for creating social bonds, for dissolving ordinary social boundaries, and for facilitating the kind of collective experience that reinforces group identity and commitment. If you want to persuade hundreds of people to spend weeks hauling multi-ton stones up a hillside, feeding them well and giving them beer is not a bad start. But Göbekli Tepe was almost certainly more than a festival site, and the question of its precise function has generated a rich and ongoing scholarly debate. Several broad interpretations have been proposed, and they are not necessarily mutually exclusive. The temple interpretation, Schmidt's own preferred reading, sees the site as a place of religious ritual, perhaps associated with a cult of the dead, with ancestor veneration, or with cosmological ceremonies connected to the astronomical observations suggested by the site's layout. The skull fragments, the headless figures in the iconography, and the presence of vultures, birds associated in many ancient Near Eastern traditions with the disposal of the dead through exhumation, the deliberate exposure of corpses to allow birds to strip the flesh, all point to a significant engagement with death and the afterlife. If the community practiced excarnation, leaving their dead on elevated platforms to be consumed by vultures, then collecting and venerating the cleaned bones, Göbekli Tepe might have been a site where this transition between life and death, between flesh and spirit, was ritually enacted and commemorated. A second interpretation, less dominant but persistent in the literature, sees the enclosures less as temples and more as large communal houses, the prehistoric equivalent of the great plank houses of the indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast of North America, where elaborate carved posts, totem poles, defined the interior space and encoded the social identity of the people who lived there. In this reading, the T-shaped pillars are not supernatural beings or deities but the analogues of totem poles, emblems of group identity, family lineage, and social hierarchy. The enclosures were meeting halls where the community gathered for both mundane and ceremonial purposes. A third interpretation, associated particularly with the German archaeologist George, reads the site as a cosmological map, a physical model of the cosmos as the builders understood it, with the circular enclosures representing different domains of the universe, the central pillars standing for the cosmic axis connecting earth and sky, and the animal imagery encoding a symbolic geography of the spirit world. In this reading, moving through the site would have been a kind of cosmological journey, a physical enactment of ideas about the structure of reality. These interpretations differ in their details but converge on a fundamental point. Göbekli Tepe was a place where meaning was made and maintained. It was a place where the community's understanding of itself and its world was given physical, durable form. Whether we call it a temple, a meeting hall, or a cosmological map, the site served a function that we recognize immediately even across 11,000 years. It was a place where human beings came together to deal with the biggest questions they faced, and where the answers, however provisional, however mythologized, were carved into stone to last beyond any individual lifetime. The feasting, the construction, the ritual, the imagery, all of it served a single overarching purpose that anthropologists call social cohesion. Göbekli Tepe brought people together. It gave different communities a shared project, a shared symbolic language, and a shared sacred geography. In a world where cooperation between groups of people who were not kin was crucial for survival, for coordinating hunts, for managing resources, for negotiating access to territories, for finding marriage partners outside the immediate community, the mechanisms that created and maintained such cooperation were among the most important things a society possessed. Göbekli Tepe, in all its grandeur, may have been above all else a machine for creating community across the distances and differences that otherwise kept people apart. Now we arrive at perhaps the most intellectually explosive aspect of Göbekli Tepe, the way it has forced archaeologists and historians to reconsider the entire story of how human civilization began. To understand the revolution that Göbekli Tepe triggered, we need first to understand the story it disrupted. For most of the 20th century, there was a clear and elegant narrative about how human civilization arose. It was a story that made intuitive sense, that could be taught in schools and fit on a single diagram, and that most educated people absorbed so thoroughly that it felt self-evident rather than theoretical. The story went like this. For most of human prehistory, hundreds of thousands of years, people lived in small bands, moving through the landscape, hunting animals and gathering wild plants. They were nomadic, egalitarian, and intellectually capable but technologically simple. Then, around 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, something changed. People began to grow crops. They domesticated animals. The transition to agriculture, what the influential Australian archaeologist V. Gordon Childe dubbed the Neolithic Revolution in the 1920s, created a surplus of food that freed some people from the labor of production, allowing them to specialize in other activities: building, crafts, trade, governance, religion, and art. With surplus came permanent settlements. With settlements came cities. With cities came writing and laws and temples and kings. Agriculture was the great engine that drove everything else. This was the standard model. It had the virtue of simplicity and logical sequence. Agricultured surplus, settlement, complexity, civilization. Each step followed from the previous one. Nothing could come before what it depended on. Göbekli Tepe demolished this model. Here was a site of extraordinary monumental complexity, built with remarkable skill and coordinated labor, decorated with sophisticated and symbolically rich imagery, functioning as a major regional center for ritual and social interaction. And it predates agriculture in the region by at least 1,000 years. It predates pottery. It predates permanent settlements in the conventional sense. The people who built it were, by the assumptions of the old model, supposed to have been too busy surviving to build anything like this. They were supposed to lack the social complexity, the specialized labor, the organizational capacity, and the spiritual sophistication that such a site requires. But they had all of it. Before the farms, before the cities, before the kings, the discovery of Göbekli Tepe did not just add a new data point to the old story. It required a new story. And the new story that is emerging from the excavations there, and from the broader revolution in Neolithic archaeology that Göbekli Tepe helped catalyze, is considerably more complex and considerably more interesting. One of the most provocative ideas to emerge from the Göbekli Tepe research is what we might call the religion-first hypothesis. The possibility that symbolic belief systems, the complex ritual, ceremonial, and cosmological dimensions of human social life, did not follow from agriculture and settlement but preceded them, and may in fact have been the driver that pushed human communities toward farming in the first place. Klaus Schmidt himself articulated this hypothesis in a memorable formulation. First came the temple, then the city. He argued that the massive investment of labor and resources in the sacred enclosures at Göbekli Tepe would have created intense pressure to find ways to feed the large gatherings of workers and worshippers. This pressure, he suggested, may have pushed communities toward more intensive management of wild plant resources, experimenting with cultivation, and eventually making the transition to full agriculture. The need to feed the temple builders, in other words, may have given rise to farming, not the other way around. This hypothesis is supported by a remarkable piece of geographical evidence. The region of southern Turkey around Göbekli Tepe is the same region where the wild ancestors of the earliest domesticated cereals grew. Wild einkorn wheat, Triticum bioticum, has been traced by geneticists, using DNA analysis, to a specific population of wild plants that grew on the slopes of the Karakadag Mountains, only about 100 kilometers northeast of Göbekli Tepe. The domestication of einkorn wheat, the earliest cultivated cereal in human history, happened in exactly the area where Göbekli Tepe was at its height. The correlation is not proof of causation, but it is the kind of correlation that makes you pay attention. The Stanford archaeologist Ian Hodder, who directed the excavations at Çatalhöyük, a major Neolithic settlement about 300 kilometers west of Göbekli Tepe, put it well when he said in response to the Göbekli Tepe findings, "This shows sociocultural changes come first, agriculture comes later." You can make a good case this area is the real origin of complex Neolithic societies. The implication is dizzying. If religion, or more precisely, the complex ritual and symbolic life that we associate with religious belief, drove the development of agriculture rather than following from it, then the entire sequence by which we understand the origins of civilization is inverted. Not surplus creates leisure creates spirit, but spirit creates gathering creates surplus creates settlement. The cathedral before the city not as metaphor but as literal historical sequence. This does not mean that the Neolithic Revolution was simply a religious phenomenon, driven by nothing but ritual enthusiasm. The transition to agriculture was a complex, multi-causal process that unfolded over centuries and was driven by many interacting factors: climatic change, demographic pressure, ecological opportunity, and yes, social and ideological transformation. But Göbekli Tepe insists that ideology, belief, ritual, the need to maintain collective meaning in a complex social world, was not a passenger on this process. It was a driver. There is another, quieter revolution embedded in the Göbekli Tepe story, and it has to do with our assumptions about complexity. The old model of civilizational development assumed that social complexity was a result of economic development, that you needed food surplus before you could have specialized labor, hierarchy, organized religion, or monumental architecture. Hunter-gatherers in this model were by definition egalitarian, small-scale, and simple, because they lacked the economic foundation for anything more elaborate. Göbekli Tepe refutes this. The people who built this site were hunter-gatherers in the technical sense. They were not farming. But they were anything but simple. They had specialized craftspeople. They had some form of social hierarchy sufficient to organize massive cooperative labor. They maintained ritual practices of extraordinary sophistication. They communicated over distances of hundreds of kilometers and drew pilgrims from across the region. And they sustained this complex social organization for 1,500 years, longer, as we noted, than the Roman Empire. The anthropologist Peter Turchin, reflecting on Göbekli Tepe, noted that it flatly contradicts the sequence of events postulated by the standard bottom-up theory. The supporting society, he observed, must have numbered in the tens of thousands to generate the surplus needed to support the construction workers. And this was before agriculture. Social complexity, in other words, does not require economic surplus in the narrow agrarian sense. It requires cooperation, shared meaning, and the organizational capacity to bring people together for common purposes. These were things that pre-agricultural communities were evidently capable of. The implications extend beyond Göbekli Tepe. If the transition from simple to complex social organization can happen without agriculture, then the story of human prehistory needs to be dramatically revised. Not just for this region, not just for this period, but potentially for the entire long arc of human social development. We may have been consistently underestimating the cognitive and social sophistication of pre-agricultural peoples. Not just here, but everywhere. We may be only beginning to understand the full depth of the human world before cities and kings. It is worth noting that this revision of prehistory is not unique to the Near East. Around the world, the last several decades of archaeological research have been consistently revealing that pre-agricultural peoples were more socially complex, more architecturally ambitious, and more symbolically sophisticated than the old models assumed. In North America, the site of Poverty Point in Louisiana, a complex of earthen mounds built by hunter-gatherers around 1700 BCE, shows evidence of large-scale coordinated labor without clear evidence of centralized political authority. In the Amazon basin, aerial surveys using LiDAR technology have revealed extensive networks of earthworks, roads, and settlements built by Amazonian peoples before European contact, suggesting levels of social organization that challenge long-held assumptions about the limits of tropical forest societies. And in southeastern Turkey itself, the Taz Tepler sites are extending the picture of sophisticated pre-agricultural social life well beyond what Göbekli Tepe alone could demonstrate. The common thread in all of these discoveries is the same insight. Complexity is older than we thought, and it does not require the specific economic trigger of grain agriculture to emerge. Human beings, it turns out, are social complex by nature. We find ways to organize ourselves, to cooperate, to create shared meaning and shared projects, to build things that outlast individual lives. And we have been doing this for far longer than the conventional history of civilization acknowledges. French archaeologist Jacques Cavin, in his influential 1994 book, The Birth of the Gods and the Origins of Agriculture, had anticipated something of this insight even before the full significance of Göbekli Tepe was understood. Cavin argued, on the basis of the explosion of symbolic imagery, what he called a revolution of symbols, that occurred in the Epipaleolithic and early Neolithic of the Near East, that cognitive and cultural changes were the primary driver of the Neolithic transition, more fundamental than environmental or economic factors. He proposed that a new relationship between human beings and the cosmos, expressed in the emergence of deity imagery, in the representation of the human figure in relation to animal figures, in the creation of sacred spaces, preceded and made possible the transition to farming and settled life. Göbekli Tepe, discovered and excavated after Cavin's book was published, provided extraordinary physical evidence for his theoretical framework. The site was, as one researcher put it, a laboratory for Cavin's hypothesis, a concrete demonstration that the revolution of symbols preceded the agricultural revolution. This intersection of cognitive evolution, symbolic culture, and social organization is one of the most exciting frontiers in the study of human prehistory today. The question of when and how the modern human mind, with its capacity for complex language, for abstract representation, for the kind of sustained cooperative intentionality required to build something like Göbekli Tepe, fully emerged is still being debated. Some researchers place the full flowering of symbolic culture well back into the Middle Stone Age, perhaps 100,000 years ago or earlier. Others see a more recent cognitive revolution, around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, associated with the expansion of modern humans out of Africa and the appearance of cave art and ornamental objects in the archaeological record. Göbekli Tepe does not resolve this debate, but it does insist that whatever the origins of the modern human mind, its consequences were visible, tangible, and monumental by 9600 BC, and probably long before. And then they buried it. This is the act that haunts every account of Göbekli Tepe, the detail that no historian or archaeologist can quite get past, the thing that distinguishes this place from other ancient sites and gives it its uniquely poignant quality. After at least 1500 years of use, of building and rebuilding, of feasting and carving and ritual and ceremony, the people associated with Göbekli Tepe did something extraordinary. They filled their great enclosures with earth and stone, covering the pillars they had carved with such care, entombing the sacred space beneath the ground. The traditional interpretation of this act, the one that held sway for many years, championed by Schmidt himself, was that it was deliberate and ritual in character. The enclosures were intentionally backfilled as part of a ceremonial process of decommissioning, a way of retiring a sacred space, returning its power to the earth, ending one phase of sacred activity before beginning another. In this reading, the burial of each enclosure was not an ending but a transformation. The enclosure died and was interred, like a revered ancestor, and new structures were built above and around it, carrying the sacred tradition forward while the old space entered a different kind of existence below the ground. The evidence for intentional burial is substantial. The fill that covers the enclosures is not random debris deposited by wind or water erosion. It is composed of limestone rubble, animal bones, and flint tools, the concentrated residue of human activity, brought to the site deliberately and used to pack the enclosure solid. The pillars themselves in the best preserved enclosures are found standing upright, exactly as they were placed, with no signs of having been toppled by force or collapsed by structural failure. They were not knocked down and covered. They were covered while still standing. However, the picture has become more complicated in recent years. After Schmidt's death in 2014, his successors at the site began to reassess some of his interpretations, and the question of whether the burial was fully intentional or partly the result of natural processes has been reopened. Recent detailed analysis of the stratigraphy, the layers of soil and debris in and around the enclosures, has revealed evidence of slope slides and structural collapses. Moritz Kinzel, an architect-turned-archaeologist who began examining the old excavation records in 2017, noticed that the damage to the enclosure walls was inconsistent in ways that would be expected from deliberate backfilling. The walls closest to the upper slope of the hill showed the most damage, exactly the pattern you would expect from debris flowing down from above, rather than from material packed in from the center or sides. The current field director, Lee Clare, has been among those arguing for a more nuanced reading that combines intentional human action with natural depositional processes. This matters because the narrative of deliberate burial carries a particular emotional and interpretive weight. If the enclosures were intentionally buried, it implies a community that still remembered and valued what lay beneath the ground, a community that understood what it was doing and chose to do it deliberately for reasons rooted in their cosmological beliefs. If the burial was largely the result of natural accumulation over time, the picture is different. Less dramatic, perhaps, but no less interesting, as it would suggest that the site was gradually overwhelmed by its own debris and eventually abandoned rather than ceremonially retired. The truth is probably somewhere between these poles, a combination of intentional filling and natural accumulation, playing out over a long period as the site's role in the community's ritual life gradually changed. This is actually consistent with what we see in many ancient sacred sites around the world, where the boundary between deliberate ritual action and natural process is blurry and contested even among those closest to the evidence. But regardless of the mechanism, the result is the same. The site was buried and it stayed buried. Whatever community had used and maintained Göbekli Tepe for 15 centuries eventually moved on, their descendants shifting to a more agricultural way of life, establishing new settlements, building new kinds of structures in new places. The great enclosures were left behind, gradually covered by the accumulating earth of the Taurus foothills. The wishing tree grew on the summit. The local Kurds continued to regard the hill as sacred, though they had no way of knowing why their ancestors had felt the same. And for 10,000 years the stones slept. The most poignant aspect of the burial, perhaps, is not the act itself but what it preserved. The deliberate or semi-deliberate covering of the enclosures turned out to be the most effective act of conservation imaginable. By filling the interiors of the enclosures with material that prevented the entry of water, wind, and subsequent human interference, the builders created an inadvertent time capsule. The carvings on the buried portions of the pillars are in far better condition than those on the exposed portions. The floors remain intact. The spatial arrangement of objects within the enclosures has been preserved exactly as it was at the moment of burial. What the ancient community hid from the world, the modern world has recovered, and in recovering it, we have received a gift that the builders never intended to give. There is something almost unbearably moving about this. These people, who could not have imagined our world, who had no conception of the future in which someone would dig up and study what they had built, who buried their sacred space for reasons of their own that we can only partially reconstruct, they preserved it perfectly for us without knowing they were doing so. The 10,000 years of silence between the last ritual at Göbekli Tepe and the moment Klaus Schmidt first put his hands on those exposed pillar tops was not empty. It was a kind of waiting. If we look at the practice of deliberately retiring and interring sacred spaces from a cross-cultural perspective, we find it is not unique to Göbekli Tepe. Many cultures around the world have traditions of ceremonially ending the active life of a sacred place or object, of marking a transition from use to sacred deposition, from active power to preserved power. In the Mesoamerican world, Olmec colossal stone heads were sometimes deliberately buried and defaced, a practice interpreted by scholars as a form of ritual termination, decommissioning the power held within the object rather than simply abandoning it. In the Celtic world of Iron Age Europe, sacred objects were deposited in water, rivers, bogs, and lakes, in rituals of offering and retirement. At the ancient Near Eastern site of Çatalhöyük, Houses were regularly filled in and new homes built directly above the ruins of old ones, suggesting that the domestic and the sacred were entangled in ways that required each building's eventual retirement to be marked and managed. What these diverse practices share is an understanding that certain objects and spaces accumulate power, spiritual charge, sacred significance, cosmological weight, through their use in ritual contexts, and that this accumulated power must be carefully managed when the object or space is no longer needed in its active role. You cannot simply walk away from something like that. You must close it properly. You must seal it, contain it, retire it with the appropriate ceremony. In this framework, the burial of the enclosures at Göbekli Tepe was not destruction or abandonment. It was an act of continuation in a different mode. The power accumulated in those spaces was not dissipated by the burial. It was preserved, concentrated, entrusted to the earth. This interpretation resonates deeply with what we know about the religious sensibility of many prehistoric and ancient cultures, in which the earth itself was a being of enormous significance, a repository of the dead, a source of fertility and life, a cosmic power in its own right. To bury something in the earth was to return it to the most fundamental level of existence, to place it in the care of the most ancient and enduring force available. The pillars of Göbekli Tepe, returned to the earth after their centuries of sacred service, may have been understood not as destroyed but as transformed, as having passed from one mode of being to another, the way the dead were understood to pass from the world of the living to whatever world lay beyond it. We will never know if this is what the builders of Göbekli Tepe believed. We cannot recover their theology, their mythology, their specific cosmological system. But we can look at the care with which the burial was executed, the deliberateness of it, the sheer labor involved, and recognize in it the marks of an act that was taken seriously, that was carried out with intention and respect. These were not people who simply walked away from something they were tired of. They were people who understood that endings have to be honored, that what was sacred does not become ordinary simply because it is no longer needed. And in that understanding, however foreign its specific content may be to us, we can recognize something deeply familiar. Klaus Schmidt returned to Göbekli Tepe every spring and autumn for nearly 20 years, typically spending 2 months on site in each season. He purchased a house in Sanliurfa, the nearest major city, and made it his base of operations. He brought in teams of German archaeologists, Turkish colleagues from the Sanliurfa Museum, and a steady rotation of students and specialists. He mapped the site with ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic surveys. He published preliminary reports, gave lectures, wrote popular books, and tirelessly advocated for the site's significance. He was, by all accounts, a man who understood completely what he had found and was determined to make the world understand it too. In a 2011 interview, Schmidt estimated that roughly 5% of the site had been excavated. He predicted, in a famous remark, that within 10 or 15 years Göbekli Tepe would be more famous than Stonehenge, and for good reason. He died on July 20, 2014 at the age of 60, from a heart attack while swimming in Germany, before he could see his prediction fully come true. His wife, the Turkish archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, continued to be involved in the site's preservation and interpretation after his death. Excavation leadership passed to the Sanliurfa Museum, with Lee Clare of the German Archaeological Institute serving as field director and coordinator of research activities, and eventually, in 2019, to Professor Nikmi Carroll of Istanbul University as director of the broader excavation project. The recognition of Göbekli Tepe's significance grew steadily in the years following Schmidt's death. In 2018, UNESCO designated the site a World Heritage Site, recognizing it as one of the first manifestations of human-made monumental architecture, and identifying its outstanding universal value as a window into one of the most momentous transitions in human history. The Turkish government declared 2019 the year of Göbekli Tepe, promoting the site internationally and investing in tourism infrastructure. A protective canopy now covers much of the excavation area, sheltering the exposed enclosures from the fierce Turkish summer sun. A visitors center has been built. The site receives tens of thousands of visitors annually. All of this development has not been without controversy. In 2018, Klaus Schmidt publicly criticized the conservation work being carried out at the site, arguing that the use of concrete and heavy machinery in constructing new walkways had caused damage to the ancient structures. Conservation and development at ancient sites involve perpetual tensions between the needs of modern access and the preservation of fragile material, and Göbekli Tepe, as a UNESCO World Heritage Site of enormous scientific importance, is an especially high-stakes arena for these tensions to play out. Meanwhile, the excavations continue to yield revelations. In 2023, as part of the broader Taz Tepler project that encompasses Göbekli Tepe and its sister sites, archaeologists found a painted boar statue at the site, a life-size wild boar sculpted from limestone and decorated with red, white, and black pigment. It is one of the oldest known painted statues in human history. It was found resting on a stone bench decorated with H-shaped symbols, crescents, paired snakes, and depictions of human faces. At the same moment, at the sister site of Karahan Tepe, 46 kilometers to the east, part of the same Taz Tepler cultural network, researchers announced the discovery of a 2.3-meter-tall human statue, among the most impressive examples of prehistoric sculpture ever found, depicted in a seated position holding a phallus with both hands, its ribs and fingers marked with deeply incised lines. Also at Karahan Tepe, excavators found the first known T-shaped pillar to bear a carved human face, a momentous discovery that provides direct evidence for the long-standing interpretation that the T-pillars represented human beings. The face carved into the top of the pillar has a prominent brow, deep-set eyes, and a straight nose, rendered with sharp, confident lines. It is the face of a person, abstract, idealized, but unmistakably human, looking out from a stone that was carved 12,000 years ago. These discoveries at Göbekli Tepe and Karahan Tepe are not isolated. The Taz Tepler project, launched in 2019 and funded by the Turkish Ministry of Culture with participation from more than 220 researchers across 36 institutions from 8 countries, is systematically excavating and documenting a network of related pre-pottery Neolithic sites across the Sanliurfa region. Sites with names like Hamzin Tepe, Sefer Tepe, Harbetsuvan Tepesi, Saybrook, and Ayanlar Hoyuk are emerging from the soil, each adding new dimensions to our understanding of the culture that built Göbekli Tepe. Some of these sites appear to predate Göbekli Tepe. Some extend into periods when agriculture was already established. Together, they reveal not an isolated wonder but an entire civilizational world, a network of communities linked by shared symbols, shared architectural traditions, and shared ritual practices across a landscape that was 12,000 years ago, one of the most dynamic and consequential places on Earth. The Taz Tepler sites are also challenging some of the specific assumptions that grew up around Göbekli Tepe in its early years of fame. Karahan Tepe, for instance, has now been shown to contain not only monumental ritual structures but also more than 30 domestic dwellings, actual houses, where people lived their ordinary lives alongside the great stone circles. This confirms what the recent excavations at Göbekli Tepe itself have been suggesting, that these were not purely ritual sites visited by nomadic pilgrims but inhabited places. Communities where daily life and sacred life were woven together in ways that defy our modern tendency to separate the religious from the mundane. The picture of Neolithic life in southeastern Anatolia that is emerging from all this work is of a complex, connected, culturally rich world that existed for centuries before the transition to agriculture, and that may, in important ways, have helped bring that transition about. It was not a world of primitive simplicity. It was a world of deep knowledge, sophisticated art, complex social organization, and profound spiritual engagement with the cosmos. It was a world, in short, that was fully human in every meaningful sense of the word. Schmidt's famous formulation, "First came the temple, then the city," has proven to be not just a provocative hypothesis but something close to a description of what actually happened in this corner of the world. The great ritual centers of the Taz Tepler culture preceded the emergence of agricultural villages by centuries. The social infrastructure that built Göbekli Tepe, the networks of communication, the traditions of shared symbolism, the organizational capacity for large-scale collective action, was the social infrastructure that would eventually build the first farms, the first permanent settlements, and ultimately the first cities of Mesopotamia, downstream on the Euphrates, some 5,000 years later. The thread runs continuously from Göbekli Tepe to Uruk, from the sacred hill to the walled city, from the stone pillar to the ziggurat. We come at last to what Göbekli Tepe means. Not what it means for archaeology or for the reconstruction of prehistory, though it means a great deal for both. But what it means for us, for human beings in the 21st century, living in cities and connected by technologies that would be incomprehensible to the people who raised these stones. What does it mean that they were there 11,000 years ago doing what they did? I think it means, first, that we have been in the habit of selling our ancestors short. The story we told ourselves, that human beings were simple and small before agriculture, that complexity and depth and sophistication were late arrivals in the human story, was never really about our ancestors. It was about us, about our need to believe that what we have built is the result of a long climb upward from something much less. Göbekli Tepe tells us that the climb was not a climb from simplicity but from one kind of complexity to another. The people who built those enclosures were not less than us. They were, in the most fundamental ways, exactly us. With the same range of emotion, intelligence, creativity, and spiritual hunger. The tools were different. The problems were different. The expressions were different. But the human being at the center of it all was the same. It means, second, that organized spirituality, the capacity to build shared meaning systems, to create and maintain sacred spaces, to gather around symbols that transcend individual experience, is not a late development of civilized life. It is one of the oldest and most deeply human things there is. Before the first farm, before the first city, before the first king or the first law, human beings were already reaching toward something beyond the immediate, already asking the questions that have no simple answers, already building the kind of collective meaning that makes large-scale social life possible. Religion, in the broadest sense of the word, is not a consequence of civilization. It may be one of its causes. It means, third, that the archaeological record is still very young. As of 2021, only about 10% of Göbekli Tepe has been excavated. The Tas Tepeler project is in its early stages. There are almost certainly major sites in this region and in other parts of the world that have not yet been found. The story of human prehistory is being rewritten not because we have found everything, but because we have found enough to know that the old story was wrong. What we will find in the coming decades may overturn our current picture just as thoroughly as Schmidt overturned the picture that preceded him. It means, fourth, that the relationship between belief and action is far more consequential than our modern, secular age sometimes acknowledges. We tend, in the contemporary world, to treat religious or spiritual belief as a private matter, something that operates in its own domain, separate from the real drivers of history like economics, technology, and political power. Göbekli Tepe refuses this separation. Here, a shared belief system, whatever exactly it was, whatever cosmological story these people told themselves about the world, organized thousands of people across a wide region into a sustained collective project lasting 1,500 years. It quarried stone and moved it up a hill. It fed hundreds of workers through seasonal feasting cycles. It created and maintained social bonds that allowed different communities to cooperate on a scale that exceeded anything purely economic calculation could have generated. Belief, in other words, was causally efficacious. It made things happen. It shaped the material world in ways that are still visible and still astonishing 11,000 years later. This is a reminder that human beings have never been purely economic animals. We have always been meaning-making animals. We have always organized our collective lives around shared stories, shared symbols, and shared sacred spaces as much as around shared resources and economic interests. The ancient economist's model of civilization, in which material conditions drive everything and ideas are mere epiphenomena, the exhaust fumes of material processes, has never fully explained why people do the things they actually do. Göbekli Tepe is a monument to the inadequacy of that model. Here, 11,000 years ago, a group of people who were objectively poor in material terms, who had no metal, no cities, no writing, no food surplus in any conventional sense, built one of the most ambitious collective projects in the history of our species, motivated by something we can only describe as belief. By the need to give shape and permanence and collective presence to a shared understanding of what the world was and what it meant. And it means, finally, that what was buried can be found. That what was hidden for 10,000 years can be brought back into the light. The people who built Göbekli Tepe eventually left, their community eventually dispersed or transformed, their specific understanding of what the site meant eventually lost. But the stones remained. They waited. And when the right person walked up that limestone ridge with enough knowledge to see what was there, the stones began to speak again. There is something almost meditative about the timescale involved. 10,000 years of silence. 10,000 years during which empires rose and fell, languages were born and died, great cities were built and destroyed, every religion that exists in the world today came into being. 10,000 years of nothing. No one walking through those enclosures, no light falling on those carved snakes and foxes, no hands touching those polished limestone floors. And yet the site was there, waiting with the patience that only stone can muster, holding its secrets exactly as they had been deposited, undisturbed. And the people of the surrounding area somehow continued to feel, across all those centuries, that this hill was worth approaching with reverence, even after the specific reasons for that reverence had been entirely forgotten. There is a message encoded in that fact that I find quietly powerful. The work of understanding the past is never complete. There are always more stones in the ground. There are always more stories waiting beneath the surface. And the capacity to hear them, to approach the ancient world with enough curiosity, enough respect for what we do not know, enough willingness to be surprised, is one of the finest things about being human. Göbekli Tepe stands on its hill above the Heron Plain. The great protective canopy built over the excavations keeps the weather off the carved limestone. Visitors walk on the new boardwalks and look down at the enclosures. The wishing tree still grows at the summit, its branches still hung with colorful cloths by people who drive out from Sanlierfa and tie their hopes to the old tree on the hill, as their ancestors did, and their ancestors before them, reaching all the way back, perhaps, to the people who first called this hill sacred. Thank you for spending this time with us. If tonight's journey to Göbekli Tepe moved you, if it gave you something to think about as you drift into the quiet dark, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to this channel. Every like and every subscription tells us that what we are doing here matters to you, and it helps this channel reach other people who might need exactly this kind of quiet, deep history in their evenings. Leave a comment below. Which ancient mystery would you like us to explore next? We read every one, and your suggestions shape where we go from here. The stones are still waiting. There are always more to find. Until next time, rest well.